Is this time for a married woman to get home? And why are you drunk and your lipstick is smudged? I want an explanation, it's all over between us. The voice echoed through the dark room like a knife ripping through the silence. The sweet smell of alcohol mixed with her cheap perfume made me sick, and I didn't know if it was because of disgust or the crushing pain in my chest. She stopped in the middle of the room, her red eyes looking away from mine, her hands shaking as she tried to take off her shoes. He didn't have the courage to face me. That's when I knew. I knew something terrible had happened that night, something that would destroy the world we had built together. I can explain, she stammered, stumbling over her words. But he couldn't. Because nothing would explain the smudged lipstick, the slightly unbuttoned blouse, the strange smell on her skin that wasn't mine. Anger boiled inside me as I tried to remain calm, but every detail screamed betrayal. My mind was spinning, trying to find answers to questions I didn't want to ask yet. And yet, they came one after another, like sharp blades cutting into my sanity. Who was he? Where have they been? What exactly happened? I stared at her, waiting for her to contradict herself, for her to stumble into lies. But she just cried. It was just one night, she whispered, as if that justified it. Just one night. The phrase resounded in my head like an endless echo. Just one night, while I spent years with her. Just one night, while I was working late to build a future for both of us. Just one night, while I was making plans to buy that beach house she dreamed of so much. Just one night, while I loved her more than anything. But perhaps the worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself. The worst was what came before that. Because now, looking back on everything, I could see the signs. The furtive glances at her cell phone, the lame excuses to leave work early, the moments when she seemed distant even though she was next to me. I ignored everything. I preferred to believe that love was enough, that time would solve any problem. I was blind. And there she was, standing in front of me, smeared like the lipstick that still stained her lips, shaking like a guilty woman about to confess. But what she didn't know was that I didn't want confessions. I wanted answers. I wanted to know if everything we experienced was a lie. Who is he? I asked, crossing my arms. She hesitated, and in that moment I knew the truth would come in bitter doses. It doesn't matter who he is, he replied, his voice wavering. It matters to me. It was a mistake. I was needy, I felt alone. Do you have any idea what I did for us? How much did I sacrifice? I know, she choked on the words, her eyes finally meeting mine. I know, and that's why I'm here. I came back, didn't I? As if coming back would erase what happened. As if returning dismantled the image of her in the arms of another man, laughing, drinking, making promises that should have been mine. Anger blinded me for a moment. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break everything around me, but what I did was worse. I shut up. I let the silence weigh between us like a sentence, and she knew. I knew that silence said more than any words. Tell me what you want me to do, she begged, taking a step forward. But I backed away. I no longer knew what I wanted. Part of me wanted to forgive, pretend nothing had happened and get on with life. Another part wanted to see her suffer. I wanted her to feel what I was feeling. It's over, I said, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew it wasn't the end. Because the questions continued. What if she was lying about it being just a one-night stand? What if he was someone I knew? And if? I needed to know. I needed to be sure. But most of all, I needed revenge. She tried to get closer again, but I raised my hand to stop her. Get out of here. Go away before I regret not shouting more. She hesitated, and for a moment I thought she was going to refuse. But then he grabbed his keys and walked out the door, leaving the echo of his faltering footsteps behind. I stood there, alone, staring at the open bottle of wine on the table, the two glasses next to it. One still had a slight red tint, probably from her smudged lipstick. I should have broken that glass. Should have broken everything. But instead I sat on the couch and stared at the door, waiting for her to come back and say something that made sense. Something that made me believe that it wasn't real. But she didn't come back. And that's how the end of our story began. Or at least, that's how I thought it would end. Because what I didn't yet know was that that night was just the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would involve lies that went far beyond that betrayal. Something that would bring to light secrets she had been hiding for years. And in the end, I would discover that her betrayal wasn't just a slip-up. It was revenge. A revenge against something I never knew existed. Something that would change everything. Welcome to the channel, where intense and exciting stories come to life. Here, we make it clear, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories presented are fictional, but they carry a powerful message about how infidelity can destroy homes, hearts and lives. Get ready to dive into a shocking narrative, full of unexpected twists and raw emotions. Take a deep breath, the story is just beginning. In the corner of the room, under the yellow light of the lamp, Ethan sat on the dark leather sofa, holding a glass of whiskey that he had barely touched. The amber liquid swayed slightly as he twirled the cup between his fingers. The clock on the wall showed almost midnight, and the house, which used to be a haven of peace, now felt cold and strange. The silence was broken only by the distant noise of cars passing down the street and the insistent ticking of the clock. His breathing was heavy, almost audible in the empty space around him. The room still smelled sweetly of Olivia's perfume, mixed with the light vanilla scent of the candle she always liked to light. But that night, the smell, instead of being comforting, seemed to suffocate him. Olivia hadn't arrived yet. Ethan tried to ignore the growing uneasiness that filled his chest. She tried to convince herself that there was nothing wrong, that she had just been late after going out to dinner with her friends, as she had mentioned earlier. But deep down, something didn't feel right. He got up and walked to the window, slightly pulling back the curtain. Outside, dim streetlights illuminated the empty street, and the wind rustled the dry leaves on the sidewalk. He looked at his cell phone once again, but the screen was still blank, with no messages or missed calls. He pursed his lips, trying to control his anxiety. Ethan had always been a trustworthy man, the kind of husband who put family above all else. I worked as a project manager at a technology company and spent hours in the office, making sure everything was perfect. He liked the organized routine, the planned schedules, and the feeling of control over his life. When he met Olivia, all of that changed a little. She was spontaneous, vibrant and unpredictable. With her long, wavy brown hair and green eyes that seemed to sparkle when she smiled, she had an energy that lit up any room. Ethan fell in love with it. She took him out of his comfort zone and made him feel alive. They got married after 2 years of dating, in an intimate and emotional ceremony, surrounded only by close friends and family. The house they built together was a reflection of their relationship. Soft colors on the walls, modern but cozy furniture, and photographs spread everywhere, memories of trips, parties and happy moments. Olivia has always had a talent for decorating. She liked to mix textures, add fresh flowers to the dining room table, and change small details from time to time. For Ethan, each move was like proof that they were growing together, adapting to each other, and creating a real home. But in recent months, something had changed. Olivia's gentle touches around the house began to feel absent. The flowers were withering without being replaced, and the subtle changes to the decor had stopped. Little things that once seemed natural began to sound like signals. Ethan wondered if it was just the stress of work or if there was something more, something he didn't want to admit. Olivia also had her own career. She ran a small design studio, creating custom invitations and decorations for events. The job required creativity and flexibility, and she loved it. He often left in the afternoon for client meetings or to pick up materials, but he always made a point of returning home before Ethan, preparing dinner or organizing a cozy space for them to relax together. He remembered the nights they would sit on the couch, talking about their dreams for the future, traveling more, maybe having kids soon, maybe adopting a dog. They had plans, and those plans felt real. But now, suddenly, all of that seemed distant. Ethan tried to push away the negative thoughts and focus on the good memories. The trip to Italy the year before, when they walked hand in hand through the streets of Venice, laughing and trying ice cream. The surprise Olivia organized for his birthday, bringing together childhood friends he hadn't seen in years. The look in her eyes when she said she loved him. That was what he needed to remember, because that was what defined who they were. But as the minutes passed, he couldn't stop doubt from creeping into his mind. The sound of a key turning in the door made Ethan straighten his posture. He placed the glass on the coffee table and turned towards the entrance. Olivia entered with her hair slightly messy and a strong smell of perfume mixed with alcohol. She closed the door slowly and stopped when she saw him. Her eyes were red, as if she had been crying, but there was something else, a hesitation in the way she looked at him, as if she were preparing words she couldn't say. Ethan held his ground, even though his heart was racing. Olivia dropped her bag to the floor and tried to smile, but the smile died before it fully formed. He felt a tightness in his chest. The woman standing before him looked different, as if an invisible barrier separated them. She took a step towards him, but stopped halfway. Ethan didn't say anything. He just watched her, waiting for her to speak, to explain why it had taken so long. Why was he in that state? But instead, Olivia looked away and ran a hand through her hair, clearly uncomfortable. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. But the tension in the room was suffocating, and every second that passed seemed to increase the distance between the two. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know what he was about to hear, but he knew that whatever the answer, nothing would be the same again. The night, which was supposed to end with the two of them together, talking about their plans for the weekend, was about to become a turning point. Ethan looked at Olivia one last time, searching her eyes for the woman he had fallen in love with, but all he found was a disturbing emptiness. And in that moment, he realized that their lives were about to change forever. Ethan couldn't sleep. The bed felt colder than usual, even with Olivia lying next to it. She was breathing deeply, like someone who had passed out from exhaustion, but he knew that her sleep was not peaceful. She turned around from time to time, muttering disjointed words that he couldn't understand. His mind, on the other hand, was spinning non-stop. Since that night, when she arrived late and upset, something inside him had changed. He tried to ignore the discomfort, tried to convince himself that everything could be explained, but the image of her walking through the door with her lipstick smudged and the smell of alcohol permeating her clothes haunted him like a persistent shadow. The next morning, Ethan got up before the alarm clock went off. He prepared the coffee as he did every day, but the sound of the coffee maker seemed louder than usual, almost annoying. Olivia came down the stairs with her hair tied up in a messy bun and a haggard expression. She gave a quick, almost forced smile and thanked him for the coffee. Ethan watched her every move, from the way she avoided eye contact to her nervousness as she moved the spoon inside the cup. He expected her to say something, anything that would break that uncomfortable silence, but all he heard were vague phrases about work and commitments. Over the next few days, Ethan began to notice patterns. Olivia left earlier and returned later and later. Messages on her cell phone became more frequent, and she always left the device face down on the table, as if she had something to hide. He tried to ignore it, tried to believe that it was just a stressful phase at work, but the doubts had already set in and wouldn't leave his mind. On one particular night, when Olivia said she needed to leave for a last-minute meeting, Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He asked who the meeting was with, and she responded too quickly, without giving details, taking the keys and leaving before he could question further. He stood there, standing in the room, staring at the closed door. Something inside him gave way, and he reached for his coat and car keys. He followed her car without thinking twice. My heart was beating fast, and my hands were sweaty on the steering wheel. He felt ridiculous for a moment, like he was being paranoid, but that feeling disappeared as soon as he saw Olivia stop in front of an out-of-the-way restaurant. Ethan pulled the car over to a nearby street and watched as she got out of the vehicle and entered the location. He waited for a while, trying to convince himself that perhaps it really was a work meeting, but when he saw her sitting at a table in the corner, with a man who was clearly not a client or colleague, the world around him seemed to fall apart. She laughed. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he saw her laugh like that. The two were leaning towards each other, their hands occasionally touching on the table. Ethan felt his blood boil, but he lay there, paralyzed, unable to move. He tried to think of an explanation, tried to find a justification for what he was seeing, but nothing made sense. Then he saw the man hold her hand, intertwining their fingers, and any remaining doubts vanished. The pain came suddenly, like a stab in the chest. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, feeling his knuckles turn white. He wanted to enter the restaurant, scream, confront them in front of everyone, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the shock, maybe it was the fear of what would come next, but he just stood there, watching, until he couldn't take it anymore. He drove home in silence, without even turning on the radio. The image of her with that man replayed in her mind like a broken movie. When he got home, he sat on the couch and stared into space, trying to understand at what moment everything fell apart. He thought about the nights he stayed up waiting for her, the dinners he cooked and the plans they made together. Everything seemed like a lie now. When Olivia returned, he was in the same place. She walked in without making a sound, as if she knew she was wrong, but as soon as she saw him sitting there, she stopped. Ethan stood up slowly, and her eyes widened. He asked her where she had been, and she lied. He said that the meeting lasted and that he later went out for coffee with a friend. He stared at her for a long moment, waiting for her to admit it, waiting for her to say something that would ease the pain he felt, but her words only made it worse. He walked up to her, eyes fixed on hers, and asked who the man in the restaurant was. Olivia froze. The silence that followed was deafening. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. That's when he knew. Ethan turned and started to climb the stairs, but she grabbed his arm, begging to talk. He let go, feeling her hand shake, but he didn't look back. He entered the room, closed the door and let the weight of betrayal crush him. The next few hours were a blur. He sat up in bed, his body feeling heavy, but his mind in a frenzy. He thought about how it all started, how he trusted her blindly, how he felt safe in the life they had together. Now, everything seemed like an illusion. He wanted answers, but he knew no answer would be enough to erase the pain. When Olivia finally entered the room, her eyes were red from crying. She tried to speak, but Ethan raised his hand, asking for silence. He needed time. He needed to understand how that woman, who promised to be by his side forever, was able to destroy him like that. She left again, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Ethan closed his eyes, but all he saw was the image of Olivia with that man, smiling as if nothing else in the world mattered. He knew that night would change everything, but what he didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. Something much darker was hidden behind that betrayal, something he could never imagine. Ethan was silent, staring at Olivia across the room. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes red and swollen from crying, but she didn't look fragile. On the contrary, there was something in her gaze that made him shudder, as if she were about to confess something much worse than he had already imagined. He crossed his arms, trying to hide the tremor in his hands, but the lump in his throat only grew. Olivia took a deep breath, but couldn't hold her gaze. She started to speak, but her voice was low and broken. He said he never wanted things to get to this point, that it had all been a mistake, but Ethan didn't want to hear excuses. He wanted the truth, naked and raw. He wanted to rip off the mask she had been wearing and understand who the woman he thought he knew really was. He raised his voice, interrupting her in the middle of a sentence, asking her to stop stalling and tell her what had happened. Olivia flinched at his firm tone, but then something changed. She lifted her head and looked at him in a way Ethan had never seen before. There were no more tears in her eyes, just a mix of guilt and defiance. She said she knew he hated her at that moment, but that she needed to tell him everything, because the truth was bigger than any mistake she could have made. She began to speak hesitantly, revealing that the man Ethan saw her with at the restaurant was not a stranger. He had been part of their lives for a long time. Ethan narrowed his eyes, confused, and asked what she meant by that. It was then that Olivia dropped the bomb. He said the man was an old friend of his, someone Ethan had trusted blindly in the past. Ethan froze, as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He asked her name, and when Olivia answered, he felt his blood heat. It was Daniel. Daniel, the friend he hadn't seen in almost 2 years. The same Daniel he introduced to Olivia shortly after their wedding, who frequented their house, who laughed and toasted at parties as if he were part of the family. He felt his stomach drop. She asked how long it had been happening, and Olivia, with a trembling voice, confessed that it started months ago, when Ethan started working more and she felt alone. She cried, saying that she never planned anything, that it all started as casual conversations, innocent messages, but soon the meeting started and she didn't know how to stop. Ethan felt a mixture of anger and disgust, but before he could react, Olivia continued. He said there was more, something he didn't know and that he needed to hear before making any decisions. She hesitated, and Ethan shouted at her to speak quickly, because he couldn't take the suspense any longer. It was then that she revealed the real reason why she had gotten involved with Daniel. She said that, months before it all started, she found documents hidden in Ethan's office. Papers that showed strange financial transactions, accounts in his name that she never knew existed. When he confronted Daniel, he said he knew what it was about. She said Ethan was hiding money from her, diverting funds into a separate account, planning to leave her with nothing. Ethan exploded. He asked her if she really believed that lie, if she thought he would be capable of something like that. Olivia said she didn't want to believe it, but Daniel showed proof, statements, messages, even contracts. She felt betrayed, humiliated, and sought comfort where she shouldn't have. He said the initial plan was just to find out the truth, but things got out of control. Ethan stood up, pacing back and forth, trying to process everything. He said that Daniel lied, that it was all a setup, and Olivia started crying again. She said she realized too late, that Daniel had manipulated her, used her fears to keep her away from Ethan. She revealed that Daniel had done this before to other women, destroying relationships and taking financial advantage of them. Ethan felt his heart speed up. He asked why she didn't come and talk to him sooner, why she trusted Daniel more than her own husband. Olivia said she was scared, that she didn't know who to trust anymore, and that she only realized her mistake when she saw Ethan break down in front of her. She said she tried to end everything, but Daniel started threatening her. He said that if she left him, he would tell Ethan everything in a distorted way, making him never want to see her again. The room was silent for a few seconds. Ethan looked at Olivia as if he no longer recognized her. He felt a mixture of hatred, sadness, and despair. I wanted to believe her, but the pieces didn't fit. He asked if she was still seeing Daniel, and Olivia lowered her head, saying that that night was about ending everything once and for all. She said she didn't have the courage to tell her beforehand because she didn't think Ethan would forgive her. He squinted his eyes, trying to find some truth in that confession. He asked her why she didn't come to him as soon as she realized that Daniel was manipulating her. Olivia said she thought she could handle it herself, that she didn't want to make things any worse. Ethan felt the weight of the revelation crush him. He wanted to scream, to break something, but instead he just sat up in bed, running his hands over his face. Olivia tried to get closer, but he pulled away, saying he needed time to think. He said he didn't know what to believe anymore, because everything she said seemed to come out of a well-planned script. Olivia fell to her knees in front of him, begging him to believe her. She said she would do anything to prove that she was telling the truth, that she still loved him, but all Ethan could think about was how much he had been deceived, not only by her, but also by someone he considered a friend. Silence settled between them once again, but now it was a heavy silence, filled with hurt and uncertainty. Olivia continued talking, trying to convince him that there was still something to be saved, but Ethan was no longer listening. His mind was fixed on Daniel, on the man who destroyed his life and who could still be out there, waiting for the right moment to strike the next blow. He looked at Olivia and said that the story wasn't over yet, because he needed to find out the whole truth. And for the first time, Olivia looked genuinely scared. Ethan left the room as if he needed air. Each step felt heavy, as if something was pulling him back. He walked down the stairs slowly, hearing the sound of Olivia's feet behind him, but he didn't look back. The room was still lit by the dim lamp lights, and her shadow appeared on the wall as she stopped at the top of the stairs. He turned to face her, and the silence between them was piercing. Olivia looked smaller, shrunken, as if she was waiting for a blow that she didn't know where it would come from. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. Her words still echoed in his head, but nothing seemed to make sense. He asked how she could hide something like that for so long. Olivia stepped down, holding the railing tightly, and said she thought she was protecting them both. Ethan laughed, but the sound came out dry and humorless. Protect? She had destroyed everything they had. He asked her if she really believed Daniel and if she even tried to confront him before betraying the very trust they had built. Olivia went down another step, her voice choked, saying that she tried to resolve it, but that Daniel manipulated her. She said he always knew what to say, how to plant doubts, how to turn small details into big questions. Ethan crossed his arms and asked if she was really expecting him to believe he was a victim when he made the conscious decision to get involved with another man. She shook her head, begging him to try to understand, saying that there was no excuse for what he did, but that everything Daniel said shook her in a way she couldn't control. Ethan approached, his eyes fixed on her, asking how it started. Olivia hesitated, but ended up saying that Daniel appeared out of nowhere, offering help when she became suspicious of the documents. She said he seemed genuine, concerned, and that he presented himself as someone who just wanted to protect her. He filled her with doubts, showing evidence that seemed convincing, and then, when she was already emotionally involved, he used it to keep her close. She said that Daniel promised to protect her, but began to demand more, to manipulate situations so that she depended on him. Ethan started pacing back and forth, trying to contain his anger. He asked how she could have been so naive, how she hadn't realized she was being used. Olivia screamed that she knew she was wrong, but that Daniel was different, that he knew exactly how to mess with her. Ethan approached and asked what else she was hiding. Olivia shivered, and that's when he realized. There was more. She looked away and said Daniel didn't stop after their first date. She tried to break up, but he started threatening her. He said he would tell Ethan everything, but with a distorted version. She cried, saying she was scared, that Daniel seemed to know their every move, like he was always one step ahead. Ethan asked why she didn't come to him, why she continued seeing Daniel even after realizing he was manipulating her. Olivia said she was afraid of the threats. Daniel knew too many things, he knew how to use words to turn everything against her. She said she tried to break it off, but he showed up at work, sent messages, even left notes on the door when Ethan wasn't there. She looked at him with pleading eyes and said she was trapped, not knowing how to get out. He walked away, running his hands through his hair, trying to digest it all. He asked if she was still in contact with Daniel, and Olivia said that the last time she saw him was that night. Ethan turned sharply and asked if she was sure. Olivia hesitated and then said he texted her that morning, saying he knew she would tell him everything. He threatened to release the photos and videos he had taken of them together. Ethan stood still. Photos? Videos? Olivia confirmed, saying that Daniel planned everything, made her fall into the trap and then used it against her. Ethan felt his stomach drop. He asked if she had the messages, and when Olivia handed over her cell phone, he read Daniel's cold, calculated words. The threats were clear, full of innuendo about destroying their lives, revealing everything to Olivia's clients and Ethan's coworkers. He threw his cell phone on the couch and said he wasn't going to leave it like that. Olivia begged him not to do anything rash, but Ethan had already made up his mind. He took out his cell phone and called Daniel. The voice on the other end sounded casual, as if he had already expected the call. Ethan remained calm, said he wanted to meet to clarify everything. Daniel quickly agreed, making an appointment at a discreet bar downtown. Olivia held Ethan's arm, asking him not to go, saying that Daniel was dangerous, but he let go and said he needed to resolve this. When Ethan arrived at the bar, Daniel was already there, sitting at a table in the back, wearing a smug smile. Ethan sat opposite, keeping his eyes fixed on him. Daniel started talking before he even said anything, saying that it was a shame that things had to come to this, but that in the end, everyone could win if he played his cards right. Ethan asked what he wanted, and Daniel said that everything had a price. Ethan laughed, but there was venom in the laugh. He asked if Daniel really thought he could get away with it. Daniel leaned back in his chair and said he knew everything, the bills, the transactions, every detail Olivia had shared. He said he had enough evidence to destroy Ethan's reputation and end his career, as well as photos that could end Olivia. Ethan clenched his fists but kept his voice steady as he said he wasn't scared. Daniel laughed, calling him naive. He said the world was full of men like Ethan, thinking they could control everything, but in the end it was the weak who ended up crushed. Ethan stood up and looked at Daniel as if he was memorizing every detail of his face. He said he would pay for everything, but Daniel just smiled and said the game was just beginning. When Ethan left the bar, he felt the weight of Daniel's words. He knew it wouldn't end there, that Daniel was more dangerous than he imagined. But what he didn't know was how far Daniel was willing to go to get revenge. And in that moment, he realized that he wasn't just fighting to save his marriage, he was fighting to save his own life. Ethan left the bar with his thoughts in disarray, his breathing short and his heart pounding. Daniel's words echoed in his mind, mixing with the image of Olivia kneeling on the floor, begging for forgiveness. He crossed the street without noticing the movement of the cars and got into his own car, gripping the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles turned white. Daniel's face remained vivid in her memory, the smug smile, the calculated way he manipulated every word. Ethan felt the anger bubble up again, but there was something deeper this time, an underlying fear of what might happen next. He knew Daniel wasn't the type to back down, and now it was clear that his threat went far beyond simple words. When he got home, Olivia was sitting on the couch, with her knees bent and her eyes fixed on the door as if she was waiting for him to come and carrying all the answers. As soon as she saw him, she hurriedly got up, but stopped when she noticed the dark expression on his face. Ethan threw the keys on the table and walked into the kitchen without saying a word. Olivia followed hesitantly, afraid of what he might have discovered. He filled a glass with water and drank it in one gulp before finally facing her. He asked if she really believed that Daniel would stop there, and Olivia slowly shook her head, admitting that she knew it was far from over. Ethan asked what else she was hiding, because he knew there were still missing pieces to this puzzle. Olivia tried to deny it, but her voice broke, and he insisted, demanding that she tell the truth before it was too late. It was then that Olivia broke down. He said Daniel threatened to expose their secrets not only to their friends and family, but also to Ethan's company's customers and investors. She said he had recorded conversations, collected information, all to use as ammunition if things didn't go his way. Ethan felt the weight of the confession like a punch to the gut. He knew that Daniel was manipulative, but he didn't imagine that he would be so calculating as to create such an elaborate plan to destroy their lives. Olivia tried to get closer, saying she would do anything to make everything right, but Ethan took a step back, keeping his distance. He asked how she could be so naive to trust someone like Daniel, and Olivia began to cry, saying that she was driven by fear, confusion, and that she was sorry. But regret was not enough. Ethan wanted solutions, not tears. He said they needed to act quickly before Daniel put his threats into practice. Olivia agreed, but the desperation in her voice made it clear that she had no idea how to get out of the situation. Ethan spent the night awake, walking around the house while Olivia slept in the bedroom, or at least tried to. He took the documents and extracts that Daniel had shown him and analyzed every detail, trying to find flaws or anything that could be used against him. But the evidence seemed legitimate, and that made him even more frustrated. He knew that if Daniel decided to follow through on his threats, everything he had built could crumble in a matter of days. The next morning, Olivia woke up with red, puffy eyes, but Ethan was already up, dressed and ready to go. He said he needed answers, that he wasn't going to wait for Daniel to take the next blow. Olivia tried to stop him, saying that confronting him would only make the situation worse, but Ethan was determined. He left the house without looking back, driving to Daniel's office, a place he knew the man used as a front for his dirty business. When he arrived, he found Daniel sitting behind a glass table, smiling as if he already knew Ethan would appear. Daniel invited him to sit, but Ethan refused, remaining standing. He said he wanted an agreement, that he was willing to negotiate to end this once and for all. Daniel laughed, saying there was no compromise possible because he liked to have control. Ethan approached, resting his hands on the table and looking straight into his eyes. He said he knew about the manipulations, the games, and that he was willing to go to extreme lengths to protect his family. Daniel leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms and feigning disinterest. He said Ethan had no evidence against him, but Ethan smiled, taking his cell phone out of his pocket and showing messages he had managed to retrieve from Olivia's device. They were messages that Daniel had sent to other women, threatening them in similar ways. He said that if Daniel didn't back down, all those messages would be turned over to the police. For a moment, Daniel seemed to lose control. He stood up abruptly, saying that Ethan was bluffing, but the firmness in his gaze made doubt creep in. Daniel started pacing back and forth, trying to find a way out. He said Ethan couldn't prove anything, but Ethan said he didn't need to prove it. I just needed to plant doubt in the right people. He said that Daniel's reputation was already tarnished and that it would take very little to completely destroy him. Daniel laughed again, but this time it was hollow. He said Ethan was making a mistake, that he would never get out of this situation clean, but Ethan didn't back down. He took a step forward, saying that Daniel had underestimated his ability to fight. He said that, as much as he was hurt by Olivia's betrayal, he wouldn't let a man like Daniel continue to destroy lives. When Ethan left the office, he felt the weight on his shoulders lift a little, but he knew the battle wasn't over yet. He returned home and found Olivia sitting at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly scrolling through her cell phone. She got up as soon as she saw him and asked what had happened. Ethan talked about the confrontation, but made it clear that it didn't mean the end yet. He said that Daniel was dangerous and that they needed to remain vigilant. Olivia held his hand, saying she trusted him to protect them, but Ethan pulled away, saying that trust should have been there from the beginning. Night fell, and Ethan sat on the couch, looking at the photos on the wall. He knew that even if they managed to get out of that situation, nothing would ever be the same again. Olivia tried to get closer, but Ethan got up, saying he needed time. She nodded, but he saw the sadness in her eyes as she walked up the stairs. Ethan stayed in the room for hours, going over every detail of the plan. I knew Daniel wouldn't back down so easily, and the tension in the air was almost palpable. He knew that the final confrontation was approaching and that he would need to be prepared for anything. The only question was how far Daniel was willing to go. Ethan was standing in front of the window, looking at the flashing lights across the street. The silence in the house was almost deafening, interrupted only by the faint click of the clock on the wall. His breathing was heavy, as if each sigh was a desperate attempt to maintain control over something that had already slipped through his fingers. Olivia was upstairs, and he could feel her presence without even seeing her. He knew she was waiting for some response, some reaction, but he had nothing more to give. All that was left was exhaustion. He took out his cell phone and scrolled through the saved messages, the ones he would use against Daniel if necessary. Their office conversation had ended with a clear warning: Daniel wasn't going away without a fight. Ethan knew the game was far from over, but he was willing to see it through to the end. He could no longer live with that shadow hanging over his head. The next morning, Ethan left early without telling Olivia. He went straight to a lawyer specializing in blackmail and stalking cases. He explained the situation in detail, handed over all the evidence he had and made it clear that he wanted to act quickly. The lawyer listened quietly before promising to take care of the case, but warned Ethan about the risks. Daniel seemed like someone who had nothing to lose, and that made him unpredictable. Hours later, Ethan received a text from Daniel. It was short, but full of threat. He said he knew Ethan had gotten a lawyer and that he wasn't going to stand by and wait to be destroyed. Ethan took a deep breath and replied that he was no longer afraid, that he was prepared to expose everything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Insecurity consumed him, but he had already gone too far to back down. When he returned home, he found Olivia sitting on the couch, eyes fixed on her cell phone. She stood up as soon as he entered, asking what had happened. He told her about the lawyer, about the decision to face Daniel head-on, and saw the concern on her face. Olivia said she was scared of what Daniel might do, that he was dangerous, but Ethan assured her he was in control. She tried to get closer, but he retreated, making it clear that, although they were fighting a common enemy, things between them were still far from resolved. That night, Ethan barely slept. The messages kept coming, each one more threatening than the last. He spent hours sitting in the room, thinking about how everything had gotten to this point. When the phone rang, in the middle of the night, he answered it without thinking. It was the lawyer. The police had obtained a warrant for Daniel, and he was to be questioned the next morning. Ethan felt momentary relief, but he knew Daniel wouldn't give in easily. The next morning, while drinking coffee, Ethan received another call. This time, it was from the police. Daniel had been found dead in his apartment, and everything indicated that he had taken his own life. Ethan was in shock, not knowing how to react. Olivia came downstairs just as he hung up the phone and asked what had happened. He told her, and she put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. In the days that followed, Ethan felt a mixture of relief and guilt. As much as I hated Daniel, I didn't expect everything to end that way. Olivia tried to get closer, saying that maybe it meant a fresh start for them, but Ethan no longer saw a future with her. He said he needed time to think, but deep down he knew their marriage was already destroyed. Olivia insisted, saying she would do anything to make things right, but Ethan shook his head. He said the problem wasn't just the cheating, but the fact that she didn't trust him enough to tell her the truth before things got out of control. She said she didn't know who she was anymore, and that made it impossible to continue. Olivia cried, begged, but Ethan remained firm. Over the next few months, Ethan focused on rebuilding his life. He filed for divorce and sold the house where so many memories had been made. She moved to a smaller apartment and started attending a support group for people who had been through similar situations. He discovered he was not alone, that betrayal and manipulation left deep scars but also taught important lessons. Olivia, on the other hand, had a hard time moving on. He tried to resume his career, but the repercussions of the scandal with Daniel tarnished his reputation. She became distant from her friends, lost important contracts and, little by little, saw her life fall apart. Tried to contact Ethan several times, but he never responded. For him, that chapter was closed. Ethan started going out more, meeting new people, and eventually found someone who made him believe in love again. It was a slow process, full of insecurities, but this time, he decided to open up and be more cautious. He learned to value honesty above all else and promised himself he would never ignore the signs again. In the end, Ethan realized that Olivia's betrayal and Daniel's manipulation not only destroyed the marriage, but also forced him to reinvent himself. He emerged stronger, more aware and, most of all, determined to never again allow anyone to make him doubt himself. Now that the story has come to an end, leave your comment saying what you thought. We want to know your opinion about this plot full of twists and turns. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more stories like this. Here, we make it clear, we do not support any type of betrayal. Our goal is to show how wrong choices can leave deep marks. Thank you for following us this far and stay tuned for more exciting stories.